It's really a pleasure to be here. And I just wanted to, I have a fairly complicated situation where I am now, so I wanted to explain a little bit. I actually work for a food company, Mars Food, which has a rice business. But I am based at the University of California in the plant science department. And I also have an association with Erie. I'm a consultant with Erie on a non-paid basis. But I worked at Erie until 2011. So the work I'm going to talk about today is work that was done at Erie. And I'm glad that everybody now knows what Erie is, so I don't have to go through that. But I'm going to talk about some work that I was involved with at Erie. And it's really kind of, as mentioned, a kind of theoretical international work in some ways. But I do think it is relevant to growing rice in a place like New England, because really what I'm going to talk about is farmers who have to deal with constraints in their environment that are not normal to the rice plant. For example, drought, flooding, salinity, and low temperature, high temperature. These are what we call stresses, and they're very common in the less favorable environments. In Asia, these environments are often associated with very poor subsistence farmers. So this is kind of the nature of the project that I'm dealing with, that I'm talking about today. But the methods that we can use now to address these problems are applicable to many different situations. And I think Susan already alluded to that in her talk this morning. I forgot my button. So as I mentioned, everybody knows about Erie. So this is a picture, another picture of Erie from the air. The Institute facilities and experimental fields. This is part of them. Actually, it's a very big experimental farm based in the Philippines. And also, Walt Rockwood alluded to the Green Revolution. Okay, so the Green Revolution was the development of the high-yielding varieties, which made such a big impact in Asian rice production areas. And IR8 was the first variety that was released by Erie. And this was the first in a new generation of high-yielding varieties that really allowed Asian rice farmers to produce enough food to meet their demands. And one of the common misconceptions about the Green Revolution is that it forced many farmers to use more pesticides and fertilizers. In fact, the varieties actually can produce higher yields even without high fertilizer levels and pesticides. So this was certainly not a requirement for the Green Revolution. But in fact, what happened after the development of IR8 was that the new varieties were bred with more resistance to insects and diseases. So this would have reduced the requirement for pesticides. Anyway, this is kind of the backdrop of what I wanted to talk about in relation to stress tolerance. And in 1975, Erie came out with a publication in their research highlights, which I think I remember reading this, and it made a big impact on me. At this point, they were saying, well, okay, the Green Revolution really has only reached about 1/4 of the rice farmers in Asia. So what about the other 3/4? What happened to them? It was generally considered that in this other 3/4 of the rice farmers, for some reason, they were not able to take advantage of the high-yielding varieties. And there could be several reasons for this, could be many reasons for this, but one of the main ones was thought to be that their rice production environments were not very favorable. They had too many stresses or so forth, and so these high-yielding varieties may not have been suitable for their farms. And so this is the time when Erie started to change their focus a bit to look more at these unfavorable environments. The original focus had been on very favorable irrigated environments, and then Erie started to change their direction. And in fact, many of the people here on the Asia Rice Foundation were at Erie during this time, actually before my time, but many of them were there at that time, and in fact were involved with these projects that I'm going to be talking a little bit about. And one of the programs they developed was this genetic evaluation and utilization program. And so the purpose of this program was to look for sources of tolerance to these stresses in the world rice collection, and then start to transfer these sources of stress tolerance, these genes, into improved varieties through breeding, through the normal breeding methods. And so this was a very large program involving many scientists, not only plant breeders, but all different disciplines of scientists, focus on this process of identifying the sources of tolerance and then assembling them into improved varieties. And as an illustration, they came up with this analogy of a kind of a cord which has different strands related to the traits that they were looking at. So this is disease and insect resistance, cold tolerance, tolerance to problem soils, drought, deep water and flood tolerance, and so forth. So the idea was to try to weave these different traits through breeding into varieties that were adapted to different conditions. So it's a case of developing a variety that's not necessarily for all the farmers, but for specific farmers who had specific problems. So I always thought that was a kind of a nice analogy. And probably Ronnie Kaufman or Harold were here. I don't know who was the responsible.
I'm sorry you have the date on there, but I did make that.
So they were definitely involved with developing this, and it was a very. I think it was really an example of a very kind of a large-scale focused breeding effort to address a serious problem of rice production in farmers' fields in Asia. And it was quite successful and ran until, I believe, I think it was the late 1980s that this program was still running and doing well. And I think that they were quite successful, especially in the insect and disease resistance. So many varieties were developed that had resistance to insects and diseases, insect and disease problems. And these were adopted by many farmers in the Asian region. Now, I think that I'm going to just give a little bit of an illustration, and I'm going to use submergence tolerance as an example because that's the one that I worked on the most, so I will use that just to show you a bit of how they went about this. So submergence is a problem in large areas of Asia where they have flooding problems. Of course, Asia, tropical Asia is very suitable for rice because they have a monsoon, right? So they have a lot of rainfall. They have heavy soils that don't drain well, and so they get a lot of accumulation of water. So they really can't grow other crops easily. Rice is very suitable because it's adapted to flooding. So that's one of the reasons why rice is such a widely grown staple crop in these environments. But of course, when you have that kind of environment, then it is prone to problems of flooding. So if you have too much rain, or if you have an overflowing of rivers or whatever, then you get flooding. And rice is not very tolerant to being underwater, totally underwater. It does well when its roots and bottom part of the plant is underwater, but not so well when the whole plant is underwater. And that's what happens. You can see from the picture that many of those fields they just disappear during those floods. And this is just kind of a schematic diagram that, like, if you, in this area where you have submergence, most of the time the water level is fine, but then you get heavy rainfall, or you get some problem of drainage and overflowing of rivers, and then the rice plants become inundated. And this causes a lot of damage. And it was estimated that about 20 million hectares of rice area in tropical Asia was affected by submergence, which is a big area. Yes?
I'm just curious, what sort of time frame you're talking about? With how long is the rice being submerged? And
okay, so
can you get submerged for a day and dry up and be okay?
Yeah, usually for one day you don't have much problem, but I would say within about 3 or 4 days you're getting damage, and in about a week, then it usually kills the plants.
So within a week of submergence?
Yeah, within a week of submergence, you're killing most of the plants. Yeah.
You're talking about submergence tolerance as opposed to deep water rice, where it gets is another type of rice.
Yeah. So anybody who's familiar with Bangladesh or those areas, they have deep water rice where, in those areas, the water stays for a longer time, and it's more of a gradual accumulation of water. And so you have varieties that can elongate and stay above the water. Even if the water is a few meters deep, they can grow through that. And a lot of places, they call that floating rice. But I'm not talking about that, so I'm glad you clarified that, Peter. It's submergence, which is short-term flooding. And so it's a kind of a different trade than the deep water trade. And also, I just wanted to comment that there's an expectation that this problem may increase in the future because of climate change. And I just had a graph that shows flood incidence occurrences over different decades. So this was a recent publication. I think it was published in Nature, I'm not sure, but it shows accumulation of these flood events over time. So it seems like the incidence of flooding is increasing already and expected to increase. So it is a problem which is it's not going to go away in any way that I could think of. So anyway, the approach to deal with this problem of flooding was the same as I mentioned about identifying the source of tolerance in the gene bank, in the collection of varieties that Susan mentioned this morning, and then trying to transfer those into improved varieties. And so this work started in the 1970s, early 1970s. Ben Vergara was one of the pioneers who really was looking at these varieties in the collection and screening them for short-term flooding. And they have found, you probably can't see that very well, but there was a variety called FR13A, which they found in the gene bank collection, which had a very high level of tolerance. There were others, but that was probably one of the best ones. And so the breeders started crossing this with the modern varieties. I think also Ronnie was probably making some of those crosses.
That FR stands for flood rice.
Right. So the flood rice, of course, was, this is a variety from India. So somebody in India who had collected these had obviously found out. But I think at Erie, you probably just rediscovered that at Erie, right? Or you already knew that?
Ben Vergara discovered
Yeah,
it.
right.
But he knew somehow he knew the story behind it. I think it was selected by a farmer in West Bengal.
Yeah, Orissa. It was from Orissa. So yeah. So the only problem with the FR13A and with some of the other varieties that they identified was that they were very tall and low-yielding varieties. They had poor grain quality, so they weren't suitable for large-scale production, but they had been selected by farmers in these environments for survival under this problem. So after quite a long process of breeding, because plant breeding takes a long time, the traditional way of plant breeding takes many years to do. So this was done over quite a long period of time, probably more than 10 years. There was a breeding effort, and varieties with high yield and submergence tolerance were eventually developed. However, most of these, or very few of these, were actually they actually got to the stage of release and adoption by farmers. They still had problems with them that the farmers didn't like the quality or the adaptation or something. So it's quite a long process to try to take a trait like submergence tolerance and end up with a variety that would be accepted largely by the farmers. So when you looked at what farmers were growing, in fact, they were growing varieties that were originally developed for irrigated areas and then kind of spilled over to these rain-fed, unfavorable areas. But they were susceptible to stresses, and examples include Mashuri, Swarna, IR64, and so forth. So so the farmers were not adopting the stress-tolerant varieties very much. I'm talking particularly about submergence, but also the drought-tolerant varieties, for example. So I had worked at Erie during the 1980s, and I had been working on submergence and drought and other things. And then in the 1990s, I left Erie and I came to University of California, Davis, and I was working on rice genetics. And then in 2001, I returned to Erie to work again there in the breeding department. So when I went back in 2001, I was looking at these rain-fed areas, these unfavorable rain-fed areas, to see what had happened during the time that I was gone from Erie. And I found that, as I mentioned, I couldn't find farmers growing varieties that were specifically developed with stress tolerance. They were growing irrigated varieties, basically. But they had the problem of stresses. So whenever they had a drought or a flood, they got a lot of damage in their fields. But they were growing varieties that they liked because of high yield, good quality, and so forth. And these were areas, varieties, as I mentioned, that spread from favorable irrigated areas into these unfavorable areas. So I think this was a sign that we needed a new approach of how to improve the tolerance of these varieties for farmers in those unfavorable areas. Now, in the meantime, I mentioned I was at Davis, and we started to work on the genetics of submergence tolerance. And we identified that in FR13A, there's a gene, a major gene in this variety, which gives this tolerance, high tolerance to submergence. And you can see on the corner a picture of, these are the ones that don't have the gene and the ones that have the gene. So if you flood them for about 2 weeks, the ones that don't have the gene die. The ones that have the gene do very well. They recover and survive and do well. And so we called that the sub-1 gene. We call it sub-1 because we're thinking, oh, well, we might find others that we call sub-2, sub-3, sub-4. We never found those other ones. We just found the sub-1. But it was good enough because it gives a very high level of tolerance. And these are some of the people that had joined, had been working with me on that project. Just mentioned that Kenong Xu did most of the work. He was my graduate student, now at Cornell, based in Geneva, right? In Geneva. Apple breeder. So rice and apples, you know, it's almost the same. Pam Ronald had been at Cornell.
Submergence in apples.
Is he? Oh, good. Glad to see that. So you could see that he got very good training from me to work on submergence. Yes?
When you're talking submergence adaptation, are you talking about does the rice then have the ability in those plants to get the air from by other means, or what is the?
Okay, thanks. That's a good question. I didn't say that, but the mechanism of tolerance actually is it's not something you would have expected necessarily. What happens with rice when it's underwater is it has a response of rapid elongation. So it's kind of like, oh, I'm underwater, and try to get out of the water as fast as it can. So it grows fast, right? What happens when it's underwater is that when it starts to grow rapidly, it then depletes all its reserves, all its carbohydrates, and it dies very quickly. So it cannot sustain that kind of growth over many days. So the difference with a sub-1 plant is it actually goes into kind of a semi-dormant state when it's underwater. So once the water goes down, it's still a normal plant, and it takes off and starts growing again. So it's a mechanism of trying to avoid panicking, basically. Yeah, avoid panicking. Yeah. Huh? It holds its breath. Yeah. So we called it sub-1. There was another scientist in Japan who discovered the gene for the rapid elongation, and they named those snorkel genes. Snorkel. So that one allows the plant to grow very fast. So anyway, my daughter is an artist, so I asked her to make a picture of sub-1 for me, and she made a rice. It's actually a little bit like a rice grain, and like a submarine, and it has sub-1 logo in it. So, and we named it the submarine gene as a nickname. But now, yellow submarine. It's a yellow submarine. Yes. It's got a propeller and everything.
Great marketing.
So,
Golden submarine.
golden submarine, I don't know. I like yellow submarine better. So what do you do with this kind of information what we wanted to do is to use this in developing submergence tolerant varieties. And Susan mentioned about the backcrossing approach, right? To introduce a gene from one variety into another by backcrossing. That's a traditional kind of a breeding method that's been used a lot. But with these markers, you can now do this very precisely and quickly. So what I had here is just a representation of the 12 chromosomes of rice. And on the map of the 12 chromosomes, the sub-1 locus, the sub-1 gene is there. And so we can use that information now to quickly develop a new variety that has that sub-1 gene, but doesn't have all the other genes coming from the original parent, like FR13A, which were unfavorable. And this is not done by DNA transfer or genetic modification. It's really kind of an adaptation of a normal breeding process. So it doesn't result in a GM plant. And so the good thing about that is we can take one of these mega varieties, like Swarna was the one we started with. This variety was grown on probably 5 or 6 million hectares, this one variety, in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And so we took that variety. It has very good yield, it has good quality, and we introduced this gene by this process. And it took us a little over 2 years to do that. So it's very quick compared to regular breeding, which takes usually 5 to 10 years, and then you have to do a lot of evaluation. So what you get when you do that kind of process, so I'll show a picture. So this was our first test in 2007 in the field. And this is a field at Erie Farm, but it's basically a tank. So we can flood it with over 1 meter of water for 3 weeks, for 18 days actually, 18 days. So I think you could probably pick out which ones have the sub-1 gene and which ones don't. You don't have to be a plant breeder to do that. But these are 3 pairs of varieties. 3 of them have the sub-1 gene and 3 of them don't. But they're the same variety with or without. So for example, this variety has a sub-1 gene. I think this was IR64, and this is this IR64 without the sub-1 gene. So it shows you the big effect you get from this one gene that was transferred by this method I mentioned.
Can I ask a question?
Yes?
So in that pool, when you're flooding it, is the entire plant actually
Completely underwater. Completely underwater for 18 days.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah.
And then they grow out.
Yeah. So this is what happens to a normal plant in a farmer's field. Yes?
Varieties are in there?
There's 3 pairs of varieties here. So there's IR64, Swarna, and Sama Mashuri with and without the sub-1 gene. Yeah, yeah.
3 pairs and 3 reps, right there.
Yes, 3 pairs and 3 reps. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mention that. There's 3 replications. So the replications go, I think, this way. Yes?
Would the individuals that did survive the flooding, do they have some special resistance?
No, they don't. No, it's a kind of a little bit like a threshold trait. So you always get a little bit of survival, right? But it's basically they all have the same genetic makeup. They're identical.
It's
So
the frequency spectrum of survival that you would get in that population of plants.
yeah. So normally you get from 0 to 100%, right? And if you have higher submergence stress, the percentage survival goes down and goes down. But you still get a little bit of survival.
But
It just
those
by
individual plants that do survive, do they have?
No, they're not tolerant. If you take the seed from if you can take the seed from these and plant again, they'll be susceptible. Yeah.
So the frequency is the same in the succeeding generations?
More or less, depending on how long you submerge them. Yeah. So if you submerge them longer, you get higher death.
Got it.
We developed 6 varieties in the initial project, which have the sub-1 gene, and this is all 6 of them. Can you see it? Okay. I mean, it's so basically. This is each variety is grown side by side with the susceptible version. So you can see that it worked in all the 6 varieties very well. And it took about between 2 to 3 years to develop all these, over the whole project to develop these 6 varieties. And each of these varieties were popular varieties in different countries that had the problem of submergence. So we did that so that, because there was a lot of work to do this, we did that because we wanted to have the maximum chance that the farmers would accept them. Because when you go to the farmers with a completely new variety, they're very skeptical and is it going to be better than the one I'm growing? Can I sell it? If I grow it and harvest, can I sell it? So we wanted to have maximum chance that they could adopt that variety without much change in the way they're farming, because that would be a whole new variable if we have to introduce something totally new. So when we go to farmers and they're growing Swarna, but they have a problem with submergence, we could say, if you grow this variety, then it's basically the same as Swarna. With no submergence, you get the same yields, you get the same quality, you can sell it just like the same as Swarna. But if you have submergence, it's going to survive much better. Now, all of these varieties that I showed you, the last 2 pictures, those pictures came from our experiment station grown in tanks, okay? So we control everything. We just put the water on 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. But what happens in a farmer's field? Okay, you're not controlling anything, right? These are uncontrolled areas. So that was the big question. And I had some question in my mind, how will this perform under a farmer's field where you might get 2 or 3 floods in a month or something, or you may get less duration or something, or more duration, whatever, or gradual flood, whatever. So there's no control in the farmer's field. So we wanted to really test them in the farmer's field. And that was a challenge because you can't just order up a flood in a farmer's field. It's just, you have to put the experiments out and then just hope that at some point you'll get this kind of test, right? And one of my friends at Erie had a joke that if you wanted to have a good rainfall in a particular field, just put a sign saying drought tolerant experiment and you would get good rainfall. So really it seemed like it would go against you, right? So we countered that by numbers. We put out many trials, hundreds of trials of paired varieties, submergence tolerant and non-submergence tolerant, over different areas, just to try to maximize our chance that we would get some flooding. And then we found results actually even better than the experiment station. That was a good thing. So this is an example of a field that was submerged in the earlier stage of growth. And I don't know if you can see that from the light, but the one on the right is there giving a very nice crop. The one on the left is almost gone. So normally what happens, what happens here is if the flooding comes early, relatively early, the farmer over here will replant the field. So they'll just clear it. They'll try to get seedlings from somewhere of an early variety and replant. They always get a low yield because they're out of the calendar season. They're planting too late. But they'll try to do something. Whereas in this field, of course, it's like a normal crop now, just recovered. So we found differences of yields, something like sometimes we get like 4 tons under this condition and maybe 1 or 0 under this condition. So very big difference of yields in the 2 fields. In the right side was more interesting because there we had a flooding at the panicle initiation stage. So that's the stage just before heading, the booting, before the booting stage, where we didn't really expect it to be tolerant because of the mechanism. I mentioned about the elongation problem of plant underwater. So at that stage, there wasn't that much elongation going on. But we still saw a very dramatic difference. Under flooding at that stage, Swarna was completely empty. The grains were totally empty. There was no grain at all. It was 0. And under the normal field, it was producing quite decent crops. So we got very good result under a wide range of conditions. Another thing we saw, which was very interesting, is that in some fields, the submergence was very short, like about 4 days. And so when you have 4 days submergence, you don't get a lot of damage in the field. So the intolerant plants will recover and produce a crop. But even in those conditions, the varieties with the sub-1 were giving an advantage of about 1 to 2 tons per hectare. So that's quite a big advantage. And we actually didn't anticipate that, but that was discovered by some of the farmer tests that we did where they actually had these shorter duration flooding. So even though the plants were recovering, they were still damaged and they weren't producing much yield. So anyway, the result of this was that by this stage, this was around 2007, 2008, the farmers were convinced, the government was convinced, and so they were ready for scaling up this to a larger scale to introduce these varieties to the farmers. So fortunately, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came through with a large grant to help us promote these submergence tolerant varieties, as well as other varieties that we were working on which were tolerant to drought. Some of our other breeders were working on drought tolerance and salt tolerance. And so the Gates Foundation funded us with a large project, and part of that project was to help increase the seed and disseminate the seed to a large number of farmers. So this just has a kind of, we call the project Strasse, which means stress-tolerant rice for Africa and South Asia. So that's focused in 3 countries of South Asia. That's India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And I think it was 21 countries in Africa. So we started the multiplication in 2006. The project actually started, originally, the breeding project started in 2004. Actually, late 2003. So by 2006, we already had the varieties under evaluation in these countries. And by 2009, they were officially approved by the governments after the testing. And at the same time, we were working on seed production. So this just, don't worry about the numbers, but just shows you the kind of numbers, like 40,000 tons of seed production by 2011. Huge amounts of seed being produced and distributed. And if you look at the number of farmers that were growing them, by 2012, the estimate was 3 million farmers. So it's a huge number of farmers. Of course, we're talking about Asia, where this is a staple crop, so there's just millions of farmers. They each have about 1 or 2 hectares of farm. And large adoption, about 1.1 million hectares in 2012. 2013,
2.2 acres.
2.2 acres, yeah. So more than 2 million acres. This year, it's 2 million hectares estimate. So that's about 4.5 million acres. So it's quite a rapid adoption of sub-1 varieties. Now, one of the neatest things I think about the project was that, we initially anticipated that the varieties would basically replace the original varieties. So like Swarna sub-1 would replace Swarna in the seed chain and production. But our group in India felt that they wanted to accelerate the delivery of the varieties to the farmers who needed it the most. So we started to do some satellite mapping of flooding. So they were able to map the areas that were most prone to flooding by data that they had available in India. And they did this by state and by district. And so they actually ended up with a list of villages that were identified as submergence prone based on this data. And so the government funded a large effort to deliver seed of the submergence tolerant varieties to those districts. So some of these were very remote, but at least this gave us a way to prioritize how the seed would be distributed. Now, I talked a lot about flooding because that's the one I was most familiar with and was our early success story. But I just wanted to mention that we were working on other stresses, and drought is a good example. And we found almost the same thing. If you look at what the farmers are growing, their varieties are not tolerant to drought. So they were suffering, every time there's a drought, they were suffering quite a bit. And so there were drought-tolerant varieties available. And so we started a similar process with that. And those varieties are now also becoming quite popular in areas of eastern India that have problems with drought. And I did have one data slide on that. IR64 and IR36 were 2 very popular varieties in India, for example. And under severe drought, this is the red, their yields collapsed quite a bit. So they're getting less than about 1,000 kilograms per hectare, more or less equal to pounds per acre. But some of these drought-tolerant varieties were getting double the yields under those same conditions. So these yields are relatively low for Asian farmers. But you have to remember that these are subsistence farmers in drought-prone areas. So really, in many cases, they're growing rice for their family, for their close friends. And if they have extra, they can sell that to the market. But when they have a drought, a lot of times they lose everything. And it's very devastating on them. So having a variety that would allow them to get through those drought years could be very, very useful. So these varieties are now being grown. The issue of salinity came up this morning. We also had some salt-tolerant varieties that were doing well. As Susan mentioned, they're tropical. They're indica varieties. But genetically, so submergence is a special case because the sub-1 gene has such a big effect. Okay, let's admit it. So not all of these stresses have genes that have such a large effect as the sub-1 gene. But in the case of drought, we estimated that with 3 of the drought-resistant genes, we could get quite a large effect. So now those three genes are being introduced in varieties in the same way as sub-1. And in fact, they're being introduced in varieties that have sub-1. So now you have varieties that are going to be submergence and drought tolerance. And that's important because a lot of areas are so variable that you can get either stress in any year. So we're trying to combine multiple stresses. Salinity is another one where we're, for example, a lot of these coastal areas have both salt and flooding. Yeah. Okay, so that maybe the next generation would be the three. So we're having this was a little bit later than submergence story, but it's going along well now, especially the drought. The last time I was at the meeting earlier this year, the drought-tolerant varieties were in high demand now and spreading quite a bit. So it seems like the project is having quite good impact on these three major stresses. And
Excuse me.
yes?
What is the mechanism with the drought tolerance? Because I think if there's no water, they can't grow. Do they kind of also hold their breath until the drought is over? Or?
That's a more difficult question. It's not as well characterized as for submergence, and there seems to be different mechanisms for the drought tolerance. The main one, I believe, is the deeper root system, which allows them to. It's actually not. I wouldn't say that we're talking about varieties that can produce well without water. I think we're talking more about varieties that can kind of hold on with the drought stress and still actually get tap water deeper in the soil. So they can avoid some of the stress by tapping into a deeper levels of water in the soil as the soil is drying out.
But we should say they also have to slow down their growth, because otherwise they'll compete with each other in the community and they'll deplete the water. So
Yeah, it's
depending on
complicated,
how
yeah.
long the stress lasts, you have to have different mechanisms. And the way in which they do that's why it's three genes. It's not a single, because drought is never one thing. So you have to have this combination of mechanisms.
But one thing that surprised me was that the results were fairly consistent. Like, for example, the group that's working on this at Erie, they found very similar results when they tested their materials in India, which was their main testing site. So, it seems like when you get something that has this drought tolerance, it works fairly well. I mean, it works better than I would have expected, considering the complications of mechanisms of drought tolerance.
And Dave, you might mention where the drought tolerance is coming from.
Ausch varieties, I guess, mainly. So yeah, it's coming from ultimately. There are different sources, but probably most of the tolerant donors are it's a special kind of indica varieties, which you may have talked about this in the past. I don't know, but yeah, the Ausch varieties. So
But it's interesting that it's
Bangladesh and India.
But the
Yeah.
same region that has naturally evolved mechanisms for submergence has evolved mechanisms for drought and mechanisms for salt.
And salt, yeah.
Because deep
Yeah.
down in the pathway biochemically, it's all connected. It's all the same pathway. It's diverged because the plant has to know what to respond to. The signal, drought or salt, is different, but the pathway and the response to the plant is fundamentally the same for these stresses.
Is there a relationship then between, for instance, upland rice varieties and this drought tolerance?
You would think so, but no. Those upland varieties. that's
Well, the
why-
Ausch varieties are kind of upland. They're
But
kind
they're
of
not
upland.
the tropical Japan.
Yeah, they're not the. When we talk about upland varieties in Southeast Asia, no, they're not. But they're a special kind of upland varieties, which are more like
in
in.
the first rains, right? They're sown with the early rains.
Right. They're kind of like a pre-monsoon crop.
Exactly.
Yeah, so they sow them when it's dry, and then when the rain comes, they're actually designed to give a crop in a very short period of time. They're very vigorous. They compete well with weeds, but they don't yield very much. But as Susan mentioned, it's peculiar that they seem to be a source of a wealth of stress-tolerant traits. And I wouldn't have expected salinity necessarily from those varieties, but they do. It does seem to be coming from there too. So they're very interesting. Yeah.
And just one comment, you might think, oh, let's just breed for deep roots. That was the simplistic vision before. Doesn't work, because you just create new competition. And in fact, then the plant overinvests in a deep root, and then it doesn't produce as well when you don't have that stress. So it's a combination of much more the ability of the plant to respond appropriately to the environment rather than to constitutively express something that it doesn't always need. And that, I think, that's why, like, the understanding of these things is evolving very quickly.
Well, another thing that I should mention is that when I talk about drought tolerance, especially in relation to this work in the Strasse project, we're really talking about fairly severe water stress in farmers who are really kind of subsistent type farmers. Many people in the U.S., especially in the Mississippi Delta, have asked me, "Oh, should we have drought tolerance?" Because we have water shortage as well, and I never recommend that because this is these are not going to yield very high, right? So farmers who are dependent on higher yields, they may not benefit very much from this kind of drought tolerance. You know, it's a very, like a drastic situation. Now there is a different situation, which is we call it aerobic rice, where you grow rice, and probably some people here have actually been doing that, even though they may not have known the name. But aerobic rice would be where you're not flooding, but you're still giving enough water so that the plants are not really stressed out. So that's a different one, and there are genes also that give tolerance to this situation, but it's different from what I mentioned about this survival of under severe drought. So farmer in the U.S., I would never say, oh, you should be breeding for drought tolerance or looking at drought tolerance, because it's really kind of a drastic situation. I mean, the best way to solve it is to irrigate it, right? But these are in areas where they don't have access to this irrigation.
In the salt tolerance, David, could you characterize what the mechanism is? Is that's like tidal flooding or estuarial salt contamination?
There are different. There are different.
Irrigation mitigation.
Okay. So that's one source is through irrigation, and so you would see that more in like inland areas, which are a little bit drier and they irrigate a lot, and so you get evaporation. And but there's also the coastal intrusion. So they're quite different environments, and we were actually looking at both those situations, and the varieties would be different in each situation. The varieties for the inland salinity, where irrigated areas, are different than the ones for the coastal saline areas, and they have stress at a little bit different stages. For the mechanisms, it's also very complicated, but one of the key ones was exclusion of sodium uptake by the roots. So there are varieties that can exclude the sodium. So that's one. But there are other mechanisms. It's not a single gene like sub1, but it's relatively straightforward to breed for that. Yeah.
Could you talk about a little bit about cold tolerance?
That okay. So my next slide. Okay. So this is cold tolerance. Now I wasn't planning to talk about cold tolerance because I really I don't have a lot to say about it. But my student in Davis did his thesis on that, and there have been major genes identified for cold tolerance. He was looking at the vegetative stage. So you can, like, if you grow indica variety, in your condition, probably it turns yellow, right? So that's what you see, and the japonica stays green. So that's a kind of cold tolerance, and that's usually controlled by major genes. But probably a more interesting one is the brooding stage, which relates to the sterility. And there's been some work in Japan there's a paper published in 2003, and they used a variety from Indonesia. It's a japonica, tropical japonica from Indonesia as a source, and they were able to transfer some genes from that variety into their they call it Norin something, Norin 20, is it Norin 20? They developed a variety which introduced this gene from Silewa into their variety, and apparently it has a higher level of cold tolerance. But beyond that, I haven't seen very much of the approach that I mentioned that we were using in transferring major genes in cold. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. There's been a lot of success in breeding for cold tolerance. The California breeders have been doing it, and they have some varieties that are pretty good. And of course, Hokkaido is the classic example.
The bread from the Hokkaido and the California, those cold tolerance gene, is the same or different?
Oh, I think they would be similar, probably. but I don't think that's been studied. Yeah, I haven't seen very much study on that, so I'm not sure about it. Yeah.
Spell that variety,
Hokkaido. How do you spell Hokkaido?
H-O-K-A-I-D-O.
Yeah, that's the northern province of Japan.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
The breeding station.
The northern island, I guess, of Japan. Northern island.
Almost all the varieties that are being grown by Ogi, a lot of those are Hokkaido varieties.
So Hokkaido is like, as I mentioned, I was talking about these, what some people call it marginal environments or unfavorable environments or extreme environments. So Hokkaido is a good example, and you're probably also a good example. I used to think California was a good example as well, but yeah, now that I've come here, California is too easy, too easy. We get very high yields. But you know, like in California, we couldn't grow indicas, for example. They just kind of turn yellow. In the southern U.S., you can grow indicas, although they're not grown much, but you can grow them. But in California, no. And here, even the California varieties, I was told, are not good enough. So they're too late, or you know, they're not. Yeah. So you need a little bit warmer. Yeah, maybe Massachusetts, where they can grow.
Yeah, down there in New Jersey, Delaware.
So I'm finished, but you know, I always give this acknowledgement at the end, and it's too many, so I'm not going to read it. But I need to give thank you to the donors like Gates Foundation, German government, and so forth. Many countries gave us a donation to do this work, and I need to mention also the farmers. One of the things that's really shifted over the last several decades is the participatory research with farmers, and so we got a lot of support by working directly with farmers in Asia. This is a picture of some women farmers who actually what they're doing is they're going through a variety trial, and they vote on the varieties they like and they don't like. So now that information, they get a few cards and they put them by the varieties they like, and this information is actually now used in varietal releases in India. So it's a really major paradigm shift, whereas before it was like the scientists develop the variety and then gives it to the farmer, and the farmer should grow it. And the scientist has to tell the farmer, this is how you grow it. No more. So now the farmer is involved this has been done, of course, a long time in the US, but in Asia, this shift had to occur. So we get a lot of support by farmers. And then another farmer on the right is from India, who actually spread the submergence tolerant varieties on 1,000 acres before we ever heard of him. And we had no connection or anything. Somebody said, oh, by the way, they're growing 1,000 acres in Andhra Pradesh, and so we never gave them seed. How did it happen? So we went there, and this farmer had gotten the seed and started his own program and then started spreading it by himself. So we really got huge support from these kind of farmers, and they were really tremendous people to work with. So it was really a gratifying experience. Thank you very much.
One thing, because there were questions here earlier, Dave. Is the seed freely available? Do people have to request it? How is it distributed?
Okay, so the seed, so we're dealing with completely non-commercial seed. So it's all done usually through government agencies, or in some cases there are seed companies involved. But the price people pay is just the price for certified seed. So there's no royalties on any of these varieties. There's no IP on any of these varieties. It's all done through a kind of more like a public system. And then once they're available, the farmers, of course, can grow it themselves or spread it to other people. Those things may be changing in the future, but at the moment it's pretty open. But there's a lot of emphasis on seed production and high quality seed production. Because that's a serious problem in Asia, where farmers keep growing the same seed every year, and there's kind of a decline. And so we're trying to help with maintaining high quality seed production. So in our project, we had quite a huge effort on that, and a lot of people involved on seed production.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.